The lunar surface of Kepler 442c was a graveyard of hopes and dreams, littered with the skeletal remains of makeshift shelters that housed the forgotten refugees of the Outer Rim War. Dust storms swept across the barren landscape with mechanical regularity, carrying with them the bitter taste of broken promises and abandoned treaties. In this desolate place, survival was measured not in years or months, but in the precious hours between one meager meal and the next. Zarathil pressed her three younglings closer to her chest as she made her way through the winding paths between the refugee shelters. Her people, the Zelani, had once been proud traders and explorers, their bioluminescent scales shimmering like living starlight as they navigated the space lanes between worlds. Now, those same scales had dulled to a sickly gray, their inner light dimmed by malnutrition and despair. The youngest of her children, barely past his first molting, whimpered softly against her shoulder. His name was Kethera, which meant bright future in the old tongue, a name that now felt like a cruel joke. His siblings, Valina and Soreth, were old enough to understand their situation, though they rarely spoke of it. The hollow look in their large, amber eyes spoke volumes about the hunger that had become their constant companion. Zarathil had watched 17 other families attempt what she was about to do. 17 desperate parents who had swallowed their pride and knocked on the door of the only trader still operating in this forgotten corner of space. 17 rejections. 17 more families whose children went to sleep hungry that night. But what choice did she have? The humans' trading post sat at the edge of the refugee camp, like a strange monument to prosperity. Unlike the ramshackle shelters that surrounded it, the building was solid, well-maintained, and emanated the warm glow of functional heating systems. Solar collectors and atmospheric processors hummed quietly on the roof, testament to the resources that lay just beyond their reach. Marcus Chun had arrived on Kepler 442c 3 months ago, setting up his small trading operation with an efficiency that had impressed even the cynical camp administrators. He was typical of his species in many ways. Average height, unremarkable features, brown hair that seemed perpetually disheveled despite his attempts to maintain some semblance of professionalism. What set him apart was his apparent indifference to the suffering around him. While other traders had at least pretended sympathy before turning the refugees away, Marcus had simply posted clear signs indicating his prices and policies, then gone about his business with mechanical precision. No credit, no bartering with personal possessions. Standard galactic currency only. It was a policy that effectively excluded every refugee in the camp, and everyone knew it. Zarathil paused at the edge of the trading post's illuminated perimeter, her heart hammering against her ribs with a rhythm that felt like a countdown to her own destruction. Behind her, she could sense the other refugees watching from their shelters. Word had already spread that she was going to try. They waited with the kind of desperate hope that came from having no other options, knowing that if she failed, it would be another night of listening to their children cry themselves to sleep from hunger. The 3 younglings in her arms stirred restlessly. Kethera's breathing had become more labored over the past few days, a sign that his developing respiratory system was beginning to shut down from lack of proper nutrition. Valina, the middle child, had stopped asking when they would eat, her natural curiosity dimmed by the grinding reality of their situation. And Soreth, the eldest at barely 6 years old, had taken to staring at the trading post lights with an intensity that broke her hearts. Zarathil forced herself to take the first step forward, then another. The gravel crunched beneath her feet with each footfall, a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the thin atmosphere. Her people's traditional robes, once a vibrant blue that complemented their scales, now hung in tatters around her thin frame. The weight of her children seemed to increase with every step, not from their physical mass, but from the crushing burden of what she was about to do. She had been a respected xenobiologist before the war, her research into cross-species compatibility earning her recognition throughout the sector. She had walked the halls of universities and research stations with pride, her scales gleaming with health and intellectual satisfaction. The irony was not lost on her that those same studies had taught her enough about human physiology to know that what she was about to offer was actually possible between their species. The knowledge tasted like ash in her mouth. As she approached the trading post's main entrance, She could see Marcus through the transparent aluminum windows. He was seated at a workstation, his attention focused on a holographic display showing shipping manifests and inventory reports. The blue light from the hollow projector cast strange shadows across his unremarkable features, making him appear almost alien in the artificial illumination. Zarathil had studied his routines over the past weeks, noting the precise schedule he maintained. Every morning at 0700 hours, he would emerge to check his atmosphere processors. At 1200 hours, he would take a break to consume his midday meal. At 1800 hours, he would begin his evening inventory count. And at 2100 hours, he would lock down his systems and retire to his private quarters in the back of the building. It was now 2147 hours. She was counting on his adherence to routine, hoping that the disruption of an unexpected visitor would work in her favor somehow. Desperate people often convince themselves that timing could change everything, that the right moment might soften even the hardest hearts. She reached the entrance and hesitated, her hand hovering over the door chime. Through the window, she could see shelves lined with food packages, medical supplies, and basic necessities, everything her people needed to survive another day. The sight of such abundance, so close yet so impossibly far away, made her scales tighten with frustration. Behind her, Kythera coughed weakly, the sound like a tiny motor failing to start. The noise galvanized her into action, and she pressed the chime before her courage could abandon her entirely. The soft, musical tone echoed through the trading post, and she saw Marcus look up from his display, his expression shifting from concentration to mild annoyance. He glanced at the chronometer on his workstation, clearly noting that someone was disturbing him outside normal operating hours. For a long moment, he simply stared at the door, and Zarathil wondered if he would ignore her entirely. She pressed the chime again, more insistently this time. Marcus sighed. She could see his shoulders rise and fall and push back from his workstation. He moved with the deliberate pace of someone who is not accustomed to unexpected interruptions, his steps measured and careful as he approached the entrance. The door slid open with a soft hiss, and Zarathil found herself face-to-face with the human trader for the first time. Up close, his brown eyes held a depth that the surveillance footage hadn't captured, and she noticed that his skin showed the kind of weathering that came from time spent on harsh worlds. He was younger than she had expected, probably not much past his third decade by human standards. "We're closed," he said without preamble, his voice carrying the flat tone of someone delivering a rehearsed response. "Operating hours are posted on the door. Come back tomorrow if you need something." "Please," Zarathil managed to whisper, the word catching in her throat. We need help." Marcus's gaze shifted to the three younglings in her arms, and she saw something flicker across his expression, too quick to identify, but definitely there. His eyes lingered on Kythera's labored breathing for a moment before returning to her face. "I don't do charity," he replied, but his voice had lost some of its mechanical quality. "Standard galactic currency only. No exceptions." "I know," Zarathil said quickly, before he could close the door. "I know you don't make exceptions, but I have something to offer." She saw his jaw tighten slightly, and she realized that he probably thought she was going to try to bargain with jewelry or family heirlooms like the others had attempted. "I've told your people before, I don't deal in personal effects. They're too hard to convert to liquid assets, and I can't verify their authenticity without proper documentation." "Not objects," Zarathil said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Myself." The words hung in air between them like a toxic cloud, and she watched Marcus's expression shift from mild irritation to something much more complex. His brown eyes widened slightly, and she saw his hands clench into fists at his sides. "I'm sorry, what?" Zarathil forced herself to meet his gaze, drawing on reserves of courage she hadn't known she possessed. "Take me for one night. Do whatever you want with me. Just feed my children. Please." The silence that followed seemed to stretch for eternity. She could hear the wind whistling across the lunar surface, the distant hum of the atmosphere processors, and the soft whimpering of Kythera as he struggled against his weakening condition. But, most of all, she could hear the thundering of her own hearts as she waited for Marcus's response. His face had gone completely still, and she realized that she couldn't read his expression at all. Human facial features were different enough from Zalani that subtle emotions were often lost in translation. But the complete lack of any visible reaction was somehow worse than outright rejection would have been. "You're offering to—" he began, then stopped himself, his voice trailing off as he seemed to struggle with the concept. "Yes," Zarathil said quickly, wanting to get the words out before her courage failed entirely. "I know it's possible between our species. I used to be a xenobiologist before all this. I know enough about human physiology to know that we're compatible. And I was considered attractive by my people's standards before the hunger took its toll." She was babbling now, trying to fill the terrible silence with words, but Marcus held up a hand to stop her. "How long?" he asked quietly. "How long what? How long since they've had a proper meal?" The question caught her off guard. She had expected him to ask about her proposition, about the terms of their potential arrangement, about what exactly she was willing to do. She hadn't expected him to ask about her children. 8 days, she replied honestly. "We had some nutrient paste 8 days ago. Before that, it had been 6 days. Marcus's jaw worked silently for a moment, and she saw his gaze drift past her toward the refugee camp beyond. "How many of you are there?" "In the camp? Nearly 3,000. My family? Just the 4 of us. My mate died in the orbital bombardment of Zalani Prime." Something shifted in Marcus's expression, so subtle that she almost missed it. When he looked back at her, his brown eyes held a different quality, still unreadable, but somehow less distant. "Wait here," he said, and stepped back into the trading post. Zarathil felt her heart skip as the door began to slide shut. Had she misunderstood? Was he rejecting her offer and simply ending the conversation? She had been prepared for him to accept her degrading proposition, had steeled herself for the humiliation and physical discomfort that would follow. She had not prepared herself for uncertainty. Through the window, she watched Marcus move through his trading post with sudden urgency, grabbing items from shelves and stuffing them into cargo containers. She saw him select packages of food, medical supplies, and what looked like portable heating units. Her confusion grew as she realized he was gathering far more than would be needed for just her family. Minutes passed. How many, she couldn't say. Time seemed to move differently when you were standing on the threshold between hope and despair. Kithera's breathing grew more labored, and she adjusted her grip on him, whispering soft reassurances in the old tongue. Finally, the door slid open again. Marcus emerged carrying 2 large containers, setting them down carefully beside the entrance. When he straightened, his expression was still unreadable, but there was something different about his posture, a tension that hadn't been there before. "There's enough there for your family for 2 weeks, he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Real food, not just nutrient paste. Medical supplies for the little one's respiratory issues. Clean water tablets, and basic hygiene items." Zarathil stared at the containers, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. I don't understand. What about my offer?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was softer than she had expected. "Go feed your children," he said simply. "But the payment, there is no payment. Not the kind you were offering." He paused, then added, "Come back tomorrow during regular hours. We need to talk about the rest of your people." Before she could respond, before she could ask what he meant or what had changed his mind, Marcus stepped back in his trading post, and the door slid shut between them. Zarathil stood in the artificial light, staring at the containers of supplies that represented more wealth than she had seen in months. Slowly, hardly daring to believe it was real, she knelt and opened the nearest container. The smell of real food, not recycled nutrients or synthetic proteins, but actual prepared meals, hit her like a physical force. She saw packages of things her children had never tasted. Fresh fruit, preserves, real grain crackers, protein bars that actually contained protein from natural sources. Kithera stirred in her arms, his weakened senses somehow detecting the presence of food. His large eyes opened, focusing on the containers with an intensity that broke her hearts all over again. "Mama," Velina whispered, her voice hoarse from thirst. "Is that—" "Yes, little star," Zarathil replied, tears beginning to track down her scaled cheeks. "That's food. Real food." As she began to divide the supplies, to carry them back to their shelter, she found herself glancing repeatedly at the trading post windows. Marcus had returned to his workstation, but she could see that he wasn't looking at his displays. Instead, he was staring out at the refugee camp beyond, his expression lost in thought. She wanted to understand what had just happened, wanted to know why he had given her everything she needed without asking for anything in return. It defied everything she knew about humans, everything the galaxy had taught her about their nature. But as Kethera began to breathe more easily in anticipation of food, as Velina's scales began to show the faintest hint of their natural luminescence, as Soreth actually smiled for the first time in weeks, Zarathil decided that understanding could wait. Her children were going to eat tonight. For now, that miracle was enough. Behind her, as she made her way back toward the refugee shelters with her precious cargo, other families began to emerge from their hiding places. Word was spreading through the camp with the speed that only hope can achieve. The human had given food. The human had helped. And tomorrow, as Marcus had promised, they would talk about the rest of her people. In the trading post, Marcus Chun sat at his workstation and stared at the holographic displays without seeing them. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for his personal communicator, scrolling through contacts until he found the one he was looking for. The connection took several minutes to establish across the interstellar distances, but eventually a familiar face appeared in the projection field. An older human woman with graying hair and kind eyes. Marcus? Sweetheart, what's wrong? You look terrible. Marcus said, his voice rough with emotion he was still trying to process. I need to ask you something. About Dad's war stories. About what he used to say about doing the right thing when no one was watching. In a refugee camp, Zarathil fed her children real food for the first time in 2 weeks and wondered what strange force had moved in the heart of a human trader. She didn't yet know that she had just witnessed the beginning of something that would reshape the galactic balance of power. She didn't know that Marcus Chun was the son of a human war veteran who had once said that a person's true character was revealed not by their strength, but by how they treated those who could do nothing for them in return. She didn't know that tomorrow would bring changes none of them could imagine. All she knew was that tonight, her children would sleep with full bellies, and that was a miracle worth more than all the stars in the sky. Dawn on Kepler 442c came not with the rise of sun, but with the gradual lessening of the artificial lights that marked the refugee camp's perimeter. The moon's tidally locked position meant that this side remained in perpetual twilight, lit only by the distant glow of the gas giant it orbited and the harsh illumination of the camp's fusion generators. Marcus Chun had not slept. He sat at his kitchen table, a cup of coffee growing cold in his hands, staring at the holographic display floating above his personal tablet. The numbers that scrolled across the screen told a story that most of the galaxy preferred to ignore, a humanitarian crisis of staggering proportions that had been quietly swept under the bureaucratic rug of the Galactic Council. 3,000 refugees on Kepler 442c, 17,000 more scattered across 6 other worlds in the sector. All survivors of the Outer Rim War, all citizens of worlds that have been conquered or destroyed, all now classified as displaced persons with no legal rights to settlement or support. The coffee tasted like ash in his mouth as he contemplated the mathematics of human decency. His personal communicator chimed softly, displaying an incoming message from his mother. He had spoken with her for 3 hours the previous night, explaining the situation he had stumbled into, seeking guidance from a woman who had spent her life teaching others about moral responsibility. "I'm proud of you," the message read. "Your father would be too. But be careful, sweetheart. The galaxy doesn't always reward kindness." Marcus smiled despite himself. His mother had always possessed the ability to be supportive and cautionary in the same breath, a skill that had served her well as a schoolteacher and had shaped his own understanding of right and wrong. A soft chiming at his front entrance interrupted his brooding. Marcus glanced at the chronometer, 0847 hours, well within his posted operating times, but earlier than most customers typically arrived. He activated the external monitors and felt his breath catch as he saw Zarathil standing outside, her 3 children clinging to her with noticeably more energy than they had possessed the night before. She had obviously made an effort to present herself more formally. Her tattered robes had been cleaned and mended as best as possible, and Her scale showed a faint hint of their natural luminescence, a sign that proper nutrition was already beginning to restore her health. The transformation was remarkable, and it made Marcus acutely aware of how much suffering a single meal could alleviate. He opened the door to find Zarathil standing straighter than she had the night before, her large amber eyes bright with something that looked suspiciously like hope. The youngest child, Kithura, was breathing normally for the first time since Marcus had encountered them. Trader Chun, she began formally, then stopped herself. I'm sorry, I don't actually know your preferred title. In my culture, we would say Lightbringer, but I realize that might not translate appropriately. Marcus is fine, he replied, stepping aside to allow them entry. Just Marcus. As they entered his trading post, he watched the children's eyes grow wide at the sight of the well-stocked shelves. Velina, the middle child, whispered something to her brother in their native language, and Soreth nodded solemnly. They're thanking the stars for your kindness, Zarathil translated. It's a traditional blessing among our people when we encounter unexpected generosity. Marcus felt something twist in his chest at the formal gratitude. These were people who had been reduced to near starvation, and yet they still found ways to express thanks for basic human decency. Please sit, he said, gesturing toward the chairs he had arranged around his workstation. We have a lot to discuss. Zarathil settled her children carefully before taking a seat herself. Up close, in better lighting, Marcus could see that she was younger than he had initially thought, probably equivalent to a human in her late 20s. The hardship had aged her prematurely, but beneath the wear and worry, he glimpsed the intelligent scientist she had once been. First, Marcus began, I need to apologize for last night. I should have acted sooner. I've been watching your people suffer for 3 months, and I told myself it wasn't my responsibility. You had no obligation to us, Zarathil replied quickly. We are strangers, refugees from a war that wasn't your concern. What you did was more than anyone had a right to expect. No, Marcus said firmly. That's exactly the kind of thinking that created this situation in the first place. Everyone deciding it's not their responsibility, not their problem, not their sector. He leaned forward, his brown eyes intense. I want to help all of you, but I need to understand exactly what we're dealing with first. Zarathil blinked in surprise. All of us. 3,000 people. That's the current camp population, according to the reports I can access. But I need to know more. What are your people's specific needs? What skills do you have? What resources might be available that the camp administrators haven't told me about? For a long moment, Zarathil simply stared at him. Then, slowly, she began to smile. The first genuine expression of joy Marcus had seen from any of the refugees. You're serious, she said, and it wasn't a question. Completely. But I'm going to need help. I'm one human with a small trading operation. What you're describing is going to require coordination, planning, and resources I don't have access to on my own. Zarathil straightened, and Marcus caught a glimpse of the professional she had once been. I still have contacts throughout the sector. Other Zalani who escaped the bombardment, scientists, and traders who knew my family before the war. Some of them have managed to establish themselves on neutral worlds. What about the other species in the camp? Mostly Karathi and Valaxians, with a few scattered families from smaller civilizations. The Karathi are natural engineers. Before the war, they were responsible for maintaining the orbital platforms around 3 different worlds. The Valaxians are farmers and terraformers, some of the best in the galaxy at making hostile worlds habitable. Marcus felt a stirring of excitement as the pieces began to fall into place. So we have scientists, engineers, and agricultural specialists. That's not a refugee population. That's a colonization force. I don't understand. Think about it, Marcus said, pulling up star charts on his holographic display. The Galactic Council has classified your people as displaced persons, which means they have no legal obligation to provide permanent settlement. But there are dozens of unclaimed worlds in this sector, planets that are marginally habitable, but would require exactly the kind of expertise your people possess to become truly livable. Zarathil leaned forward, studying the charts with professional interest. The legal framework for claiming unclaimed worlds is incredibly complex. It requires significant initial investment, proof of long-term viability, and sponsorship by an established galactic citizen. I'm an established galactic citizen, Marcus pointed out. And as for investment and viability, he paused, considering how much to reveal. My family has some resources that aren't immediately apparent from my current situation. Your family? Marcus hesitated, then decided that honesty was the only foundation for what he was proposing. My father was a military contractor during the Corps Wars. My mother is a retired educator who now runs a foundation that focuses on post-conflict reconstruction. They're not wealthy by council standards, but they have enough influence and capital to make something like this possible. Zarathil's eyes widened as she began to understand the scope of what Marcus was suggesting. You want to establish a colony. Not just provide temporary relief, but actually create a permanent settlement. I want to give your people a future, Marcus corrected. The refugee camps are designed to warehouse people indefinitely. The council profits from the desperation, cheap labor, political leverage, control populations. Breaking that cycle requires thinking bigger than just feeding people for a few weeks. The logistics alone would be staggering, Zarathil murmured, but Marcus could see that her scientific mind was already working through the possibilities. Site selection, resource surveys, establishing supply lines, legal documentation. Which is why I need to know exactly what skills and resources we have to work with. Can you give me a comprehensive survey of everyone in camp? Not just numbers, but detailed information about their backgrounds, specialties, family structures. Zarathil nodded slowly. The camp administrators maintain basic records, but I could gather more detailed information through informal networks. Most refugees know each other's stories. It's one of the ways we maintain hope, by remembering who we used to be. How long would that take? 3 days, perhaps, for if I want to be thorough. Do it, Marcus said firmly. And while you're gathering that information, I need to make some calls. If we're going to do this, we'll need to move fast. The council has been talking about consolidating the refugee camps, which is a polite way of saying they want to ship everyone to labor colonies in the Deep Rim. Zarathil's scales darkened with worry. How do you know about council plans? Marcus smiled grimly. My family's foundation maintains contacts throughout the governmental structure. Information is one of the tools we use to help people. He stood, pacing toward the window that overlooked the camp. There's something else you need to know. What I'm proposing isn't just about helping refugees. It's about changing the way the galaxy thinks about displaced populations. What do you mean? Every successful colony your people establish, every world you make livable, every community you build, it proves that refugees aren't burdens to be warehoused. They're assets to be invested in. It changes the entire political calculus. Zarathil was quiet for a long moment, absently stroking her youngest child's head as she processed the implications. You're talking about challenging the council's entire approach to post-war reconstruction. I'm talking about proving them wrong, Marcus replied. Demonstrating that there's a better way, a more profitable way, a more humane way. He turned back to face her. But I need to know that your people are willing to take the risk. Establishing a colony isn't easy. There will be failures, setbacks, probably casualties. It's not the safe option. The safe option is watching our children waste away in refugee camps while the council debates our fate in committee meetings, Zarathil said firmly. At least your proposal offers hope. Marcus nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. Then, we move forward. You gather the information, I'll start making the calls. We'll meet again in 4 days to review what we've learned and start detailed planning. There's one more thing, Zarathil said as she prepared to leave. The camp administrators are going to want to know why you suddenly started providing aid. They'll want explanations, documentation, justifications. Let me worry about the administrators, Marcus replied. I have some experience dealing with bureaucrats. As Zarathil gathered her children and prepared to leave, she paused at the door. Marcus, why are you doing this? Really? You could simply go back to your trading, avoid the complications. What changed your mind? Marcus was quiet for a moment, thinking about his father's stories, his mother's teachings, and the way Kithara had struggled to breathe in his mother's arms. My father used to say that the measure of a civilization isn't how it treats its most successful citizens, but how it treats those who have lost everything, he said finally. Last night, I realized I've been failing that test for 3 months. After they left, Marcus stood alone in his trading post and contemplated the magnitude of what he had just committed to. Establishing a colony would require resources he wasn't sure he could access, political maneuvering that might strain his family's influence, and personal risks that could destroy everything he had worked to build. But as he looked out at the refugee camp, at the hundreds of families trying to survive in conditions that would shame most civilizations, he knew that the greater risk lay in doing nothing. He activated his long-range communicator and began placing the first of what would be many difficult calls. "Hello, Mom. It's Marcus. I need to talk to you and Dad about the Foundation's emergency protocols. We're going to need to move some serious resources, and we're going to need to move them fast." In the refugee camp, Zarathil made her way through the winding paths between shelters, her mind racing with possibilities she hadn't dared to imagine 24 hours earlier. Other refugees watched her passage with curious eyes, noting the improved health of her children, whispering questions about what had transpired with the human trader. Word was already spreading through the unofficial networks that connected the camp's various communities. The Karathi engineers were talking in hushed tones about the possibilities inherent in unclaimed worlds. The Valaxian farmers were discussing soil composition and atmospheric requirements with an enthusiasm that had been absent for months. Hope, Zarathil realized, was a contagious thing, and Marcus Chun had just introduced a virulent strain into a population that had been immunized against it by months of despair. As she reached her family's modest shelter, she found her eldest child, Soreth, drawing in the dust with a pointed stick. The image he had created showed a structure with clean lines and multiple levels, not the ramshackle shelters they had grown accustomed to, but the kind of permanent building that spoke of futures rather than mere survival. "What are you drawing, little star?" she asked. Soreth looked up with eyes that held more light than she had seen in them for months. "A home, Mama. A real home. Do you think the human can really help us build one?" Zarathil knelt beside her child and studied the drawing more closely. Despite his young age, Soreth had incorporated architectural elements that spoke of Zalani design principles, but also included features that seemed inspired by what he had observed in Marcus's trading post. "I think," she said carefully, "that sometimes the most impossible things become possible when the right people decide to make them happen." As night fell over the refugee camp, families gathered around small heating units and shared stories of the worlds they had lost, the lives they had lived before war swept everything away. But for the first time in months, those stories were followed by tentative discussions of futures that might be built rather than merely endured. In his trading post, Marcus worked late into the night, reviewing surveys of unclaimed worlds, researching legal frameworks for colony establishment, and gradually building a network of contacts who might be willing to support an unprecedented humanitarian operation. The galaxy was about to learn that humans possessed a particular talent for turning desperate situations into opportunities for transformation. But that lesson would come with a price, and not everyone would be pleased with the changes it would bring. Change, after all, was rarely comfortable for those who profited from the existing order. And the existing order had very deep roots indeed. 5 days after his conversation with Zarathil, Marcus found himself standing in the main assembly area of the refugee camp, facing nearly 300 representatives from various families and communities. The gathering had grown beyond anything he had anticipated. Word of his proposal had spread through the camp's informal networks faster than a solar storm, carrying with it a mixture of hope, skepticism, and desperate curiosity. The assembly area was nothing more than a cleared space between shelters, marked by a circle of fusion lanterns that provided harsh, practical illumination against the perpetual twilight. Representatives sat on salvaged crates, folded blankets, and in some cases directly on the rocky ground. Despite the humble surroundings, Marcus could feel the intensity of their attention like a physical force. Zarathil stood beside him, her scaled features composed, but her posture betraying nervous energy. Over the past few days, she had thrown herself into the task of gathering information with the methodical precision of her scientific background. The datapad in her hands contained detailed profiles of nearly every refugee in the camp. Their skills, their backgrounds, their family structures, and their dreams for the future. "They're waiting for you to explain the impossible," she murmured to Marcus in English, a language that few of the assembled refugees understood fluently. "Be prepared for resistance. My people have learned to be suspicious of promises that sound too good to be true." Marcus nodded, studying the faces before him. He could see the mixture of species that represented the survivors of the Outer Rim War. Zalani with their dimmed scales, Karathi with their distinctive ridged foreheads, Valaxians whose normally green-tinted skin had taken on a grayish pallor from malnutrition. Scattered among them were representatives of smaller civilizations, individuals whose entire peoples might number in the dozens rather than thousands. "Friends," Marcus began, his voice carrying clearly in the thin atmosphere thanks to the portable amplifier Zarathil had procured. "I know that many of you have heard rumors about what I'm proposing. I'm here tonight to separate fact from speculation, and to ask for your help in making something unprecedented happen." A Karathi engineer near the front raised a clawed hand. "Human," he said in heavily accented standard, "we have heard promises before. The council promised resettlement. The aid organizations promised permanent solutions. What makes your words different from theirs?" "Because I'm not promising you anything," Marcus replied bluntly. "I'm proposing that we build something together. There's a difference between a promise and a plan, and what I'm offering is the foundation for a plan." He activated a portable hollow projector, filling the air above the assembly with star charts and planetary surveys. "These are unclaimed worlds in this sector. 17 planets that meet basic habitability requirements, but have been deemed too difficult or too expensive for major development by the Council's member species." A murmur ran through the crowd as they studied the holographic displays. Marcus watched their faces, noting the way their eyes tracked across the data with professional interest. These were not the faces of broken refugees. These were the faces of engineers, scientists, farmers, and builders who have been forced into circumstances that didn't reflect their true capabilities. "Zarathil has compiled detailed information about your skills and backgrounds," Marcus continued. "What she's found is remarkable. You're not a refugee population. You're a colonization force. You possess exactly the expertise needed to make these worlds livable, profitable, and permanent." An elderly Valaxian woman stood slowly, her movement aided by a walking stick carved from local materials. "Child," she said, her voice carrying the authority of age and experience, "I have lived through 3 wars and 2 economic collapses. I have learned to recognize the difference between hope and fantasy. What you suggest requires resources that dwarf anything a single trader could provide." Marcus smiled, having expected this challenge. "You're absolutely right, which is why I've spent the last 5 days building a network of support that extends far beyond my personal resources." He gestured to Zarathil, who activated a secondary hollow display, showing a complex web of connections spanning multiple star systems. "My family operates a post-conflict reconstruction foundation that has been working in war-torn regions for 40 years. Over the past 5 days, I've convinced them to commit significant resources to this project." The crowd leaned forward as Zarathil manipulated the display, revealing the scope of the network Marcus had assembled. Financial institutions willing to provide development loans. Shipping companies offering reduced-rate transport. Scientific organizations prepared to contribute survey teams and technical expertise. "But that's just the beginning," Marcus continued. "The real power of this network lies in its political connections. My mother has spent her career building relationships with council bureaucrats, sector governors, and trade administrators. She's already begun laying the groundwork for fast-tracking our colony applications." A Karathi engineer who had been studying the planetary data spoke up. "These worlds, they're not garden paradises. Most of them have significant terraforming requirements. Atmospheric adjustments, soil treatment, ecosystem establishment. We're talking about decades of work." "Exactly," Marcus replied enthusiastically. "And every day of that work creates economic value. Colony development isn't charity, it's investment. These worlds will become productive members of the galactic economy, generating tax revenue, trade opportunities, and scientific advancement." Zarathil stepped forward, her scientific background lending authority to her words. "I've run preliminary calculations based on our available expertise. With proper organization and resource allocation, we could establish 3 separate colonies within 18 months. Each would specialize in different aspects of development. One focused on industrial infrastructure, one on agricultural systems, and one on research and education. The murmur that ran through the crowd was noticeably different from the skeptical whispers that had greeted Marcus's initial explanation. He could see minds working, professionals beginning to envision possibilities that extended beyond mere survival. A young Valaxian male stood up, his green-tinged skin showing signs of improved health that marked him as one of the refugees Marcus had been quietly providing aid to over the past few days. What about the council? They profit from the current system. They won't simply allow us to walk away from the camps. They will if we make it profitable for them to do so, Marcus replied. Colony development generates licensing fees, equipment purchases, and ongoing trade relationships. We're not talking about charity. We're talking about creating new markets. He gestured to the hollow display, which shifted to show economic projections and trade flow analyses. A successful refugee colony proves that displaced populations can be transformed into economic assets. That changes the entire political equation for future conflicts. An elderly Karathi engineer who had been silent throughout the discussion finally spoke, his voice carrying the weight of decades of experience. You speak of changing political equations, young human. But politics has momentum. Changing direction requires enormous force, and that force often comes with enormous risk. You're right, Marcus acknowledged. There are risks. Some of our colonies might fail. We might face political opposition from council members who prefer the current system. We might encounter technical challenges that exceed our capabilities. He paused, looking around the assembled faces. But what's the alternative? Remaining here, watching your children grow up in refugee camps, hoping that someday the council will decide your lives have value. The silence that followed was profound. Marcus could hear the distant hum of the camp's generators, the whisper of wind across the lunar surface, and the soft breathing of nearly 300 individuals contemplating a future that had seemed impossible just days earlier. Finally, Zarathil spoke into the silence. I have children, she said simply. 3 youngling who deserve better than this. If there's a chance, any chance, that they might grow up as free citizens of a world we helped build rather than as permanent refugees dependent on the charity of others, then I believe we have to take that risk. Her words seemed to break a dam of pent-up emotion. Other voices began to join the conversation. Parents talking about their children's futures, professionals eager to return to meaningful work, elders sharing stories of the worlds they had lost, and the communities they had built before. Marcus listened to the discussion with growing excitement. This was what he had hoped for, not passive acceptance of his proposal, but active engagement with the possibilities it represented. These people were beginning to see themselves not as victims of circumstances, but as architects of their own futures. After nearly an hour of discussion, the elderly Valaxian woman who had first challenged Marcus stood again. Human, she said formally, you have given us something that has been absent from our lives for too long. You have given us agency. The question now is whether we possess the courage to exercise it. She looked around the assembled crowd, her eyes lingering on the younger refugees who represented the future of their peoples. I propose we take a formal vote, not on whether to accept this human's charity, but on whether to join him as partners in building something unprecedented. The voting process took another hour, conducted according to the democratic traditions of the various species represented in the camp. Marcus watched with fascination as different groups employed different methods of consensus building. Some through formal debate, others through quiet consultation, still others through ritualized demonstrations of support. When the process was complete, Zarathil announced the results with visible emotion. By a margin of 87%, the Assembly approves moving forward with colony planning. We are no longer refugees waiting for salvation. We are colonists preparing for departure. The cheer that arose from the crowd echoed across the refugee camp, drawing curious faces from the shelters beyond the assembly area. Marcus felt a surge of emotion that caught him off guard, pride, excitement, and a deep sense of responsibility for what they were about to attempt. As the formal assembly broke up into smaller groups, discussing specific aspects of the colonization plan, Marcus found himself approached by individuals eager to contribute their expertise. A Karathi engineer wanted to discuss power generation systems for hostile worlds. A Valaxian botanist had ideas about accelerated ecosystem establishment. A Zalani physicist proposed research projects that could advance terraforming technology. You've started something remarkable, Zarathil observed as they watched the enthusiastic discussions taking place around them. These people haven't talked about the future with this kind of passion since before the war. We've started something, Marcus corrected. This only works if everyone commits to making it work. My resources and connections can open doors, but you're the ones who have to walk through them. Zarathil nodded, then hesitated before speaking again. There's something I haven't told you about the information I gathered. Something that might change how you think about this project. Marcus turned to give her his full attention. What is it? Several of the refugees in this camp aren't actually refugees in the traditional sense. They're advanced scouts and researchers who were deliberately placed here by their respective governments. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. Explain. The Karathi Confederation, what's left of the Valaxian Agricultural Union, even the surviving Zalani research stations, they've all been quietly gathering intelligence about council policies toward displaced populations. They're documenting everything: conditions in the camps, resource allocation, long-term strategic planning. The implications hit Marcus like a physical blow. They're building a case for war crimes prosecution. More than that, Zarathil continued, they're preparing for the eventual reconstitution of their governments. When the war officially ends, when the political situation stabilizes, they intend to present evidence that the council deliberately prolonged refugee suffering for economic and political gain. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, processing this new information. How does that affect our colonization plan? It means that what we're doing isn't just about helping refugees. It's about creating precedents for post-war reconstruction. Our success or failure will be studied, analyzed, and potentially used as justification for major political changes throughout the galaxy. The weight of that responsibility settled on Marcus's shoulders like a physical burden. What had begun as an act of conscience had evolved into something with implications far beyond anything he had imagined. Do the people who voted tonight know about this? He asked. Some do. Others suspect. But all of them understand that we're not just building colonies. We're building the future of how the galaxy treats displaced populations. Marcus looked around the assembly area, watching refugee families discussing practical details of world building with the kind of focused intensity that suggested they had found purpose again. Then, we better make sure we succeed. Marcus, Zarathil said softly, there's one more thing. The reason I'm telling you this now is because you need to understand what you're really committing to. If we succeed, we'll have enemies among the council members who profit from the current system. If we fail, we'll be held up as proof that alternative approaches don't work. And if we don't try at all, Zarathil smiled, her scales beginning to show the faint luminescence that marked her species in health and happiness. Then we'll never know whether it might have been possible to change everything. As the evening wound down and refugees began returning to their shelters, Marcus remained in the assembly area, watching the stars that glittered in the eternal twilight above Kepler, 442c. Somewhere among those points of light were worlds that could become homes for these displaced people. Somewhere among them was a future that no one had yet imagined. But building that future would require more than good intentions and careful planning. It would require navigating political currents that could destroy everything they were trying to create. The real work, Marcus realized, was just beginning. Counselor Valders Kethmoran prided himself on maintaining detailed intelligence networks throughout the Outer Rim territories. As the Galactic Council's senior administrator for displaced population management, he had built his career on the careful balance between humanitarian appearance and economic pragmatism that kept refugee camps functioning as profitable enterprises. The report on his desk, however, suggested that balance was about to be severely disrupted. A human traitor, he mused aloud, his elongated fingers drumming against the polished surface of his office workspace. One individual with questionable political connections, attempting to establish unauthorized colony operations in restricted space. The report had come from multiple sources: camp administrators who had noticed unusual activities, shipping companies reporting requests for bulk transport to unclaimed worlds, and financial institutions flagging suspicious loan applications. Taken individually, each piece of information seemed innocuous. Taken together, they painted a picture of an operation that could undermine decades of carefully constructed policy. Sir, His aide, a nervous Altarian with pale blue skin and oversized eyes, hovered near the doorway with obvious reluctance to interrupt the counselor's contemplation. "Enter, Jexera," Valdris commanded without looking up from his display. "I assume you've completed the background investigation I requested?" "Yes, sir." Marcus Chun, age 32, standard years, licensed independent trader operating in the Kepler sector. Clean criminal record, moderate commercial success, no previous political affiliations of note. Jexera paused, consulting his datapad. However, his family connections are more significant than initially apparent. Valdris finally looked up, his predatory eyes focusing on his aide with uncomfortable intensity. "Explain." His mother is Dr. Sarah Chun, director of the Chun Foundation for Post-Conflict Reconstruction. His father is retired military contractor James Chun, who maintains significant commercial relationships throughout the Core Wars. Jexera's voice grew more nervous as he continued. The Foundation has assets in excess of 2 billion standard credits and political connections extending to the Council's senior advisory committees. A cold smile spread across Valdris's features. "Now we're approaching something resembling a threat assessment." "What else?" "Sir, the situation is more complex than a simple unauthorized colony attempt. Our intelligence suggests that several refugee communities have been documenting conditions in the camps with unusual thoroughness. If successful colony operations provide them with political legitimacy, they might leverage that documentation for formal complaints to the Council's Ethics Oversight Committee." Valdris stood and moved to the massive window that dominated one wall of his office, looking out over the gleaming towers of the Council Administrative Complex. Beyond the city, he could see the lights of industrial facilities that processed refugee labor into profitable products, textiles, electronics, processed foods, all bearing the official seal of humanitarian manufacturing initiatives. "Jexera," he said finally, his voice deceptively calm, "do you understand why the current refugee management system exists?" "Sir, it's not cruelty, despite what bleeding-heart activists might claim. It's mathematics." Valdris turned back to face his aide, his expression serious. "Displaced populations represent chaos. War creates millions of individuals with no legal status, no economic productivity, no political representation. Left unmanaged, they become sources of instability that can destabilize entire sectors." He activated a holographic display showing refugee statistics across multiple systems. "Our camps provide structure, purpose, and economic integration. Refugees contribute labor that supports essential industries while receiving housing, nutrition, and medical care. It's a sustainable system that benefits everyone involved." "But, sir," Jexera ventured carefully, "what about permanent resettlement? Shouldn't the goal be eventual integration into normal galactic society?" Valdris's laugh was devoid of humor. "Permanent resettlement is expensive and politically disruptive. Colony establishment creates independent political entities with their own interests and agendas. Successful refugee colonies inevitably demand representation, resources, and recognition that threaten established power structures." He manipulated the holographic display, showing economic models that illustrated the costs and benefits of different refugee management approaches. "The current system generates revenue while maintaining control. Chen's proposal threatens to demonstrate that alternative approaches are viable, which would create pressure for systematic changes we cannot afford." "What are your instructions, sir?" Valdris was quiet for a moment, studying the data that scrolled across his displays. The Chen situation represented more than a simple bureaucratic challenge. It was potentially the opening move in a larger political confrontation that could reshape refugee policy throughout the galaxy. "Contact Administrator Yexthal on Kepler 442C," he ordered finally. "Inform him that the Council requires a complete audit of all trading operations in his sector. Unauthorized resource distribution to displaced persons violates multiple regulations regarding economic interference and political manipulation." "Should I mention the colony proposal specifically?" "No. We'll approach this as a routine compliance issue until we better understand the scope of Chen's network." Valdris returned to his desk, his mind already working through the political implications. Also, initiate background investigations on everyone associated with the Chin Foundation. If they're planning something this ambitious, they'll have left traces we can exploit. Sir, what about the refugees themselves? If they're truly documenting camp conditions for future legal action. Valdres's eyes narrowed dangerously. Displaced persons have no legal standing to file complaints with the council. Their only recourse is through established administrative channels, which we control. He paused, then added, however, if they were to gain political legitimacy through successful colony establishment, that situation could change dramatically. Jexera nodded nervously, making notes on his datapad. I'll initiate the audit request immediately. One more thing, Valdres added as his aide prepared to leave. Contact Security Division and request enhanced monitoring of the Kepler sector. I want to know about every ship movement, every communication, every resource transfer that might be related to this situation. After Jexera departed, Valdres remained at his desk, studying the implications of what Chun was attempting. The human probably thought he was engaged in a simple humanitarian effort, unaware that he was challenging a system that generated billions in revenue for council member species. But Valdres had not risen to his position by underestimating potential threats. Chin's family connections and financial resources made him dangerous, and the refugee population's documentation efforts suggested a level of organization that exceeded normal camp activities. He activated his personal communicator and placed a priority call to an encrypted address that didn't appear on any official directories. "This is Valdres," he said when the connection established. "I need a full assessment of human involvement in unauthorized refugee assistance operations. Priority classification. Immediate threat to established policy." The voice that responded was electronically modulated but clearly intelligent. "Understood, Counselor. What level of intervention are you authorizing?" "For now, information gathering and legal obstruction. But I want capability assessment for more direct action if the situation escalates." "Confirmed. Initial reports within 48 hours. Valdres terminated the connection and leaned back in his chair, contemplating the chess game that was about to begin. Chin had made the mistake of assuming that goodwill and proper legal procedures would be sufficient to overcome entrenched political interests. He was about to learn otherwise. Meanwhile, on Kepler 442c, Marcus Chun was discovering that bureaucratic obstacles could multiply faster than bacteria in a nutrient solution. What had begun as routine applications for colony development permits had somehow transformed into requirements for environmental impact studies, economic viability assessments, political stability guarantees, and cultural integration protocols. "It's deliberate," his mother explained during their daily communication session. "Someone with significant influence is using administrative procedures to slow down your operation." Marcus stared at the growing stack of regulatory requirements that had arrived via official council channels. Each new demand seemed designed to consume time and resources while providing no actual benefit to the colonization effort. "Can the Foundation's legal team help?" he asked. "We're already working on it, but council bureaucracy has its own momentum. The more we push, the more resistance we encounter." Sarah Chin's expression on the holographic display showed the frustration of someone accustomed to accomplishing her goals through established channels. "I suspect we're dealing with someone who views your operation as a threat to their interests." "What kind of threat?" "We're talking about helping refugees, not overthrowing governments." "Marcus, you're challenging a system that generates enormous profits for council member species. Refugee camps aren't just humanitarian operations, they're economic enterprises. If you prove that alternative approaches are viable, you'll be threatening billions of credits in annual revenue." The implications of that statement hit Marcus like a physical blow. "You're saying the council deliberately maintains refugee populations for economic exploitation?" "I'm saying the current system has beneficiaries who won't appreciate having their profit margins threatened." Sarah paused, her expression growing more serious. "Sweetheart, I need you to understand what you're really getting into. This isn't just about bureaucratic obstacles. You're going to face active opposition from people with significant resources and no moral qualms about using them. What are you recommending? Speed up your timeline. Whatever you're planning to do it faster than they can organize effective countermeasures." Sarah's image flickered slightly as the transmission was adjusted for better clarity. And Marcus? Be very careful who you trust. Council intelligence operations have extensive infiltration capabilities. After the conversation ended, Marcus sat alone in his trading post, contemplating the revelation that his humanitarian effort had somehow evolved into a political confrontation with forces far more powerful than anything he had imagined. A soft chiming at his entrance interrupted his brooding. He looked up to see Zarathil approaching, her expression grim as she carried what appeared to be official documentation. "We have a problem," she announced without preamble. "The camp administrators have received orders to suspend all unauthorized resource distribution pending a comprehensive audit of trading operations." Marcus felt his heart sink as he realized the implications. Which means I can't openly coordinate colonization planning activities, you can't provide supplies to refugees, and anyone caught participating in unauthorized political organization will face disciplinary action. Zarathil set the official notices on his workstation. "They're trying to strangle our operation before it can gain momentum. How much time do we have? The audit begins in 72 hours. After that, everything we've been doing becomes grounds for detention and deportation." Marcus stared at the official seals and signatures that transformed their humanitarian effort into a criminal enterprise with a few strokes of bureaucratic authority. "Then, we accelerate everything. How quickly can we move the first group of colonists? Marcus, we don't even have final site selection completed, much less the legal documentation for colony establishment." "Forget legal documentation," Marcus said firmly. "We'll establish the colonies first and sort out the paperwork afterward. It's easier to get retroactive approval for successful operations than it is to get advance permission for theoretical ones." Zarathil's scales shifted to a darker hue that indicated worry. "That's incredibly risky. If we fail, everyone involved could face criminal charges. If we don't try, everyone involved will remain trapped in refugee camps while council bureaucrats profit from their suffering." Marcus activated his holographic display, showing the star charts they had been studying for days. Which of these worlds could support an emergency colonial operation with minimal preparation? Zarathil studied the data with professional intensity, her scientific training overriding her emotional concerns. "Kepler, 442b has the most favorable atmospheric composition. Basic terraforming equipment could make it livable within weeks rather than months. How many people could we move there initially? If we focus on essential personnel, engineers, medics, agricultural specialists, perhaps 200 in the first wave." Marcus nodded, his mind already working through the logistics. "That's enough to establish a viable community. Once they're there and productive, it becomes much harder for the council to justify forced repatriation." "Marcus," Zarathil said quietly, "you're talking about essentially kidnapping 200 refugees and transporting them to an unclaimed world without any legal authority whatsoever." "I'm talking about helping 200 refugees escape from a system designed to exploit them indefinitely," Marcus corrected. "The question is whether you believe that's worth the risk." Zarathil was quiet for a long moment, studying the star charts that represented possibilities beyond anything her people had dared to hope for. When she looked back at Marcus, her eyes held a determination that reminded him why the Zilani had once been among the galaxy's most respected explorers. "My children deserve a future that doesn't depend on the charity of others," she said finally. "If there's a chance we can give them that future, then, yes, it's worth the risk." "Then, we move tonight," Marcus decided. "Contact your most trusted people and tell them to be ready for immediate departure. I'll arrange transportation." As Zarathil departed to begin the complex process of organizing a secret evacuation, Marcus activated his long-range communicator and began placing calls to shipping companies, supply merchants, and equipment dealers throughout the sector. What he was attempting had never been done before: a completely unauthorized colony operation launched under the cover of darkness and bureaucratic confusion. But as he worked through the night, coordinating resources and timelines with an efficiency that surprised even himself, Marcus felt a growing conviction that sometimes the only way to change an unjust system was to prove that better alternatives were possible. The council thought they were dealing with a naive humanitarian. They were about to discover they had underestimated both the desperation of refugees with nothing left to lose and the determination of humans who had decided to make something impossible happen. The galaxy's balance of power was about to shift in ways that no one had anticipated. And it would all begin with a single ship departing Kepler, 442c, under cover of darkness, carrying 200 refugees toward a future they would build with their own hands. 6 months after the first transport ship departed Kepler, 442c, under cover of darkness, the colony of New Zephyr had become something that defied every prediction made by council economists, military strategists, and political theorists. Marcus stood on the observation deck of the colony's first permanent structure, a 3-story administrative building constructed from locally refined materials, and watched as the morning sun cast golden light across a landscape that had been transformed beyond recognition. Where atmosphere processors had once struggled against a hostile environment, carefully planned ecosystems now flourished. Agricultural terraces carved into the hillsides showed the distinctive green of Valaxian farming techniques, while industrial complexes in the valleys hummed with the efficiency of Korathi engineering. But it was the children that truly demonstrated the magnitude of what they had accomplished. Zalani younglings ran through streets that their parents had laid out according to ancient architectural principles, their scales bright with health and happiness. Korathi children worked alongside Valaxian youth in educational gardens that served as living laboratories for sustainable development. And scattered among them were the offspring of a dozen other species, survivors of conflicts that had scattered their peoples across the galaxy, now united in the common project of building something new. The morning reports. Zarathil announced as she joined Marcus on the observation deck. Her transformation over the past 6 months had been remarkable. No longer the desperate refugee who had stood at his door begging for her children's lives, she had become the elected coordinator of New Zephyr's Scientific Council, her expertise in xenobiology proving invaluable in the complex process of establishing sustainable ecosystems. Marcus accepted the datapad she offered, scanning through productivity reports, resource allocation summaries, and expansion timelines that told the story of unprecedented success. Food production is ahead of projections again. The Valaxian agricultural techniques are more efficient than anyone anticipated when dealing with properly terraformed soil, Zarathil explained with obvious pride. We're not just feeding ourselves, we're generating surplus that other colonies are already requesting. Other colonies. Marcus smiled as he considered how quickly their desperate gamble had expanded beyond anything they had originally imagined. New Zephyr had been followed by Haven's Rest, New Korathi, and Stellar Gardens, 4 independent colonies established in less than 6 months, each one proving that refugee populations could become productive communities when given proper resources and opportunities. Any word from the council? Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Councillor Valdris has filed another formal complaint demanding immediate cessation of unauthorized colonial operations. Zarathil replied with amusement rather than concern. He's also requested military intervention to force repatriation of displaced persons to their designated camps. And the response from the other council members? Remarkably lukewarm. It seems that several member species have become very interested in the economic opportunities our colonies represent. Independent worlds need manufactured goods, technological services, and diplomatic relationships, all of which provide profit margins significantly higher than refugee camp operations. Marcus nodded, unsurprised by the political shift that had followed their economic success. The council operated on pragmatic principles above all else, and it was becoming increasingly difficult to argue against colonial operations that generated tax revenue, trade opportunities, and technological advancement. There's something else, Zarathil continued, her tone becoming more serious. We've received a formal communication from the Zalani Research Collective. Marcus looked up sharply. The Research Collective represented what remained of organized Zalani government, a loose confederation of scientific institutions and academic colonies that had survived the war by maintaining strict neutrality. Their recognition of New Zephyr would carry enormous political weight throughout the galaxy. What kind of communication? A request for formal diplomatic relations. They want to establish an embassy here and begin coordinating scientific research projects. Zarathil's scales showed the faint luminescence that indicated deep satisfaction. Marcus, They're recognizing us as a legitimate political entity. The implications hit Marcus like a wave of vertigo. What had begun as a desperate humanitarian gesture had evolved into something that was reshaping the political landscape of the entire sector. How many other governments have made similar overtures? 12 so far. The Karathi Confederation wants to establish trade agreements. The Valaxian Agricultural Union is proposing technology sharing initiatives. Even some of the core world governments have expressed interest in cultural exchange programs. Marcus was quiet for a moment, processing the magnitude of what they had achieved. Zarathil, do you realize what this means? We've accidentally created a new model for post-conflict reconstruction. Instead of warehousing displaced populations, we've demonstrated that they can become the foundation for new political and economic entities. I don't think it was an accident, Zarathil replied thoughtfully. I think it was inevitable once someone decided to treat refugees as assets rather than burdens. They were interrupted by the soft chiming of Marcus's personal communicator. The caller identification showed his mother's face, but her expression was more serious than he had seen since the early days of their operation. Marcus, Sarah Chun said without preamble, you need to prepare for visitors. A council inspection team departed from the administrative complex 3 days ago. They'll arrive at New Zephyr within 48 hours. Marcus felt his heart rate accelerate. What kind of inspection team? Official designation is Colonial Compliance Assessment, but our sources indicate it's actually a joint operation between Councillor Valders's administrative division and Council Security. They're coming prepared to document violations that could justify forced closure of your operations. Can they do that legally? They can try. But, Marcus, you've created something that has political support they didn't anticipate. The economic impact reports have been extremely positive, and several council members are now publicly questioning whether current refugee policies represent optimal resource utilization. Zarathil had been listening to the conversation with growing intensity. What kind of violations would they look for? She asked. Sarah's image shifted as she consulted her own data sources. Unauthorized terraforming activities, unlicensed industrial operations, improper political organization, violation of displaced person transport regulations. They have a long list of potential charges, most of which are technically accurate. Marcus admitted grimly. We've been operating outside established legal frameworks since day one. Yes, but you've also been generating results that traditional approaches haven't achieved, Sarah countered. The question is whether the inspection team is genuinely interested in compliance assessment or whether they're simply looking for justification to shut you down regardless of your accomplishments. Marcus looked out over the thriving community that had emerged from the desperate gamble they had taken 6 months earlier. Children played in parks that hadn't existed when they arrived. Adults worked in facilities that provided meaningful employment rather than exploitative labor. Scientists pursued research that advanced galactic knowledge rather than simply maintaining minimal survival standards. Mom, what's your assessment of our political position? Stronger than Valders anticipated, but not strong enough to survive a determined assault from Council Security, Sarah replied honestly. You need to demonstrate that your operations provide benefits that can't be achieved through traditional channels. How do we do that? Show them something unprecedented. Something that proves refugee populations can accomplish things that established governments cannot. After the communication ended, Marcus and Zarathil stood in contemplative silence, watching the daily life of New Zephyr continue around them with oblivious normalcy. Whatever the council inspection team found here would determine not just the future of their colony, but the fate of refugee populations throughout the galaxy. Zarathil, Marcus said finally, what would happen if we shared our terraforming innovations with other species? The atmospheric processing techniques, your hashtag, the hook in the vast expanse of the galaxy, where civilizations rise and fall like waves upon cosmic shores, there exists a truth that few species dare to acknowledge. Desperation reveals the truest nature of any being. When hunger gnaws at empty bellies and hope flickers like a dying star, some will beg, some will steal, and others will offer the only thing they have left, themselves. But what happens when that desperate plea reaches the ears of humanity? The Galactic Council had dismissed humans as a minor species, barely worth a footnote in their extensive records. Emotional, irrational, prone to acts that defied logic and profit margins. They were tolerated in the Outer Rim colonies, their small trading posts overlooked by the major powers who controlled the flow of resources across star systems. Yet on this night, in a forgotten corner of space where refugee camps sprawled across the surface of a dying moon, a single moment would shatter everything the galaxy thought it knew about the species called human. She stood at his door, a Zilani mother, her once proud crest now dulled by malnutrition, her scales losing their luminescent glow. In her arms, 3 younglings clung to her with weakening grips, their large eyes reflecting a hunger that had gone on far too long. Behind her, an entire camp of refugees waited in the shadows, watching to see if this human traitor would be like all the others who had turned them away. "Take me for one night," she whispered, her voice breaking with shame and desperation. "Just feed my children." The human male stood in his doorway, his brown eyes taking in the scene before him. The galaxy had taught her people that humans were predictable, driven by base desires, quick to exploit the vulnerable, always looking for what they could take. She had prepared herself for his answer, for the door to close, or worse, for him to accept her degrading offer. She was not prepared for what he actually did. What followed would ripple across the stars, challenging every assumption, breaking every rule, and proving that sometimes the smallest acts of defiance against indifference can ignite the brightest flames of hope. This is the story of how one desperate plea and one human's response changed the course of galactic history forever.